Cool. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar and Fireside conversation between Laurent and myself. Today, we're here to talk a little bit about product management and how it can help in the context of venture building, but also to provide a bit of an open-minded approach to, okay, venture building being one of the many things that you can do in the context of innovation. So our agenda will be split in two. I'll have a bit of a first half where I share my experience and I take one specific case through the way we thought about this. And then we'll have a conversation with Laurent for the second half. So without further ado, let me dive into the first part. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you know, but launching products is really hard. And I picked 3 statistics that speak to me. But there are about 30,000 new consumer products being launched every single year, and 40% of them really only survive on the market. 1 out of 2 even just make it on time, not even talking about long-term survival, right? And so it's a really hard thing, and product management is a discipline that has been built over the years to try to make that more successful than not, right? And as you can see, it still remains a relatively hard thing to do. Similarly, launching ventures is a really hard thing to do. If you just look at the survival rate of startups, at 5-year survival rate, it's roughly around a 30% margin. Again, depends how you measure this. Corporate venturing has a bit of a higher likelihood of success, but it's also a really hard thing to do. And in my experience, typically launching ventures is often launching a product and the organization around that product at the same time. And with that in mind, the objective for me and for Laurent today is to share the learnings of how product management techniques have helped me be a bit more successful than average in launching ventures. There's this statistics from McKinsey that talks about if you have experience launching these businesses or these ventures, you have quite an outsized, stronger likelihood of being successful, right? You see 54% success or likelihood of success for experts versus 27 for people that have done it for the first time. Right? So hosts today, me, Martin. I'm partner at dualoop, and I've spent 8 years at McKinsey & Company, where I've worked on 7 products/ventures all over the world, really. So I was lucky to work in many contexts, many industries, and many countries to launch ventures on behalf of clients. So always in the context of corporate venturing, venture building, right? And with me, I have Laurent. Laurent will introduce himself at the beginning of the Fireside, but Laurent brings a wealth of experience as he's built quite a few ventures himself, successfully sold a few of them, and now recently authored a book on the topic of corporate venturing and providing a bit of clarity and debiasing by providing a framework as to how to think about the different models and moves that you can make to do some innovation. Definitely recommend the book, which is a bit of a shameless plug here. But so we're here to talk and to share our experience. And the first thing I wanted to do is to set the scene, right? Because product management is very often understood in different ways based on your specific company and contexts. One of the definitions that I like the most is the one that comes from Melissa Perry, Escaping the Build Trap. And she says that product management is the discipline of maximizing value created for the customer and the business over the lifetime of a product. And the reason I like it so much is because it really balances the 2 sides of the coin, right? Providing value for the customer, of course, but also building a venture, a business that is sustainable long-term, right? So that you can continuously deliver value to the customer. And so with that working definition, which really means product management is about making sure you provide value in the form of a business that continuously does so, I wanted to take a little bit of a look as if I think about building a product in any context, whether it's a product, whether it's a feature, whether it's even just a user story within that feature, there's typically 4 steps that I go through. Right? I try to really understand what the problem is. And I try to understand, who are we solving this for? Why do we want to solve this? I try to think about what are the kinds of solutions that I can really, that could address that problem, that I could build to address that problem. And then I choose one of those solutions, I put it on the market, and I make sure that I'm to measure the outcome of that solution with regards to the problem that I wanted to solve. Right? And sometimes we miss the mark, or sometimes we need to reduce a little bit of the feature sets to rationalize. And so we retire, whether it's a product, a venture, unfortunately, or sometimes just a feature, but we clean up to really narrow down on the value proposition based on the learnings. That's a topic that will come back through this conversation. That we have through this flow. Now, I presented in a very waterfally way, left to right. It's actually more of a loop or an iterative process where you understand a bit more the process, you understand a bit more what kind of solutions you can go through, how would you measure success, and sometimes retiring a feature so that you can inform better the problem and try something else. That's when I build a product. And realistically, in my experience, when I've built ventures, it's actually a relatively similar process, just at a different level. The venture is still a vehicle to solve a problem either on the market or for the company that is being built for. Right? And I'll take an example in a few minutes to explain how I think about this. It's also understanding what problem are we trying to solve, who are we building this for, what is their challenge, whether it's the company we're building it for, whether it's their customers or potentially new customers. Again, going into how are we going to deliver this? And I think that that's one of the very interesting things that Laurent has structured and brought, is there's actually many ways of building value, of innovating to solve a problem. He lists 50 of those models, which are ways to solve that problem. And again, how are you going to measure success? What's the dashboard that you're going to use? That's, again, put in the book of Laurent. What's the dashboard that you're going to use to measure the success of said venture? And then, with the end in mind, what are the exit opportunities? Some of the ventures I've built have been sold to other companies. Some have been, unfortunately, killed, and some continue to survive today. Right? But what is the learning that you bring back into your innovation strategy so that you can do it better, and so on and so forth? And so Eric Ries wrote the Lean Startup. It's probably a cornerstone of innovation still to this date. And he, at the time, was defining 4 angles or 4 pillars that he thought were interesting. The value, which is whether we are building something for solving a problem for a group of people. And again, when we're thinking about venture building, it's either the company itself or their customers or a mix of both. Right? The viability, which is, again, what I said a little bit earlier, whether we can deliver the value continuously. And that's not only the financial aspect of things, it's also the legal, the compliance aspect of things. AI, for example, is still a little bit of a blurry area right now with the AI Act coming down the horizon. So viability is the lens by which we should think about these things. The feasibility, which is, okay, can we actually deliver the value? And can we do that in an efficient way? And then the learning speed, because very often when I was building ventures, at least, the venture that we ended up building was adjacent, but rarely the one that we thought we would be building from the first, I would say, PowerPoint text. Right? And so there's a lot of learning that happens between the moment you think you have a good idea and the moment where you actually have a business that runs. And so maximizing that learning speed is a way for you to increase the likelihood of success of the venture. And so, again, Melissa Perry talks about product managers are the shepherds of risks, not the owners of output. So product management really is a discipline that is there to manage risk. And there's these 4 risks when you're building a venture. When you're building a product, we typically refer to a 5th and 6th one, which are usability and ethics, which are probably, ethics is as relevant here. Usability is probably not as relevant. But the point being, product managers are there to manage the risk and make sure that we take the right decisions at any point in time to de-risk the likelihood of success of the product or the venture that is built on top of that product. And so today I'm going to share a bit of a case study of what I've done in a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. And I'll highlight 3 of the models, and we'll come back to this slide later, but I'll highlight 3 of the models that Laurent explains in his book and just lists in his book. The ones that we'll highlight are venture building, as you might expect from the title of this talk, but also touch on strategic partnerships and acquisitions as a way to build a venture, an innovation company, or an innovative bet, however you want to call it, that helped my clients to deliver on some of their ambitions. So, a little bit about the case study. The case study is the following. I was working with a company 3.5 years ago. It was an oil and gas company, and some of their top line was being disrupted by the electrification trends. So they were losing a little bit of money, or at least their revenues was not as good as their projections, and that wasn't making them a little bit anxious. On top of it, they did not have such a culture of fast, iterative learning, which they believed was key to their success long term. And so we helped them think about what could you do to acquire this part of the culture that you think is vital to your survival, while also restoring or at least compensating for some of the top line decrease that happened in the last couple of years. And so criteria for success in that context was we needed to generate back some of the top line, and ideally we needed to generate 500 million euros back of top line. And we needed especially to build the culture for the experimentation and the learning, and to bring that culture into the incumbent organization, or at least have an arm of the incumbent organization that was able to quickly innovate and experiment. And finally, we wanted to stay outside of what Gartner and McKinsey refers to as Horizon 1 improvements. So Horizon 1 being the ones that are typically on the core business. We wanted to try things that were either adjacent or really disruptive to the core business, again, to support some of that experimentation and to support some of that top line growth. Right? We're not being cannibalizing too much on the core business. And so what we helped them think about a bunch of things. One of them was actually to think about there was a gap on the market for a B2B value offering on fleet management. So think about the Post here in Belgium. They have a fleet of vehicles. These vehicles were working on fuel engines mostly. The Post wanted to move towards electrical vehicles, but there were 2 main challenges for their kind of needs. One was they needed to have vehicles that would be charged with the right charge so that they could do the tours and the rounds of the Post people, but also they needed to be able to have depots where they could charge those cars efficiently. Right? And so we looked at a series of options. That's the option that we took and decided to go after. And when we did a bit of a survey to understand, okay, what does it mean to build a EV B2B fleet value proposition? This is non-exhaustive because it would take way too long to go into the details, but I chose 4 of the jobs to be done, which is a technique in product management that clearly identify what were the needs or the modules, the things that we needed to support for our customers. Now, the first one was we needed to help them figure out how to build and onboard depots because, again, you have a fleet of vehicles, you need a place to charge them. Right? We needed to be able to help them charge the cars and the depots efficiently, which means making sure you know which car is plugged into which charger. That's the easy bit, but also making sure that your infrastructure supports the network load and that your charging happens in an efficient way, both for the network, so that you don't overtake, or you don't surpass the limits of the network, but also importantly in terms of finances, to make sure that you don't charge at the moment where the electricity or the energy is the most expensive. We need to allow drivers to charge on the road, because if anything happened, they needed to be able to quickly charge on the road to top up their cars. And then we needed to be able to have the telemetrics on the drivers to make sure that we knew, okay, who is driving this car? What kind of route do they have? What is actually their driving style? Are they driving more? Are they and consuming more energy? Or are they, when they're driving, consuming less energy? Right? So that we could understand and coach the drivers in how to best use electrical vehicles. So these are 4 activities that we needed to build for our customer. And we started with that. One, an understanding of, okay, we know a little bit about the different modules, jobs that we need to support for the customer. We have a clear criteria for success, which is within 2 years, we need to regenerate some of that top line, and we need to have an organization that has a culture of experimentation and innovation. Right? And what I meant for us was, to be very concrete, experimentation. We wanted to have a number of experiments per week that we were running in details. Now, remember the 4 risks, right? There's, in product management, we talk about different techniques to test those risks. So testing about value is really testing about, are we solving a problem? Are we solving a problem for the customer, and is that problem important? And typically we refer to as underserved, which is they don't have another way of solving that problem, which is good enough for them. Right? And there's techniques that you can use to test these things. Some of my favorite, just in no order, Wizard of Oz is a way to just pretend that the system works and to actually try to do things manually behind the scene. The explainer video is a great one that Dropbox used before they launched, where they just created a video and pretended that it was all working and great, and they used that as a proof of value, a proof of people being interested in their product to launch and to start building. They had no product before that video. Definitely recommend going online and checking that video if you're interested. Brings you back some memories. So what did we do in our case to test for value? We did it through letters of intent. So we were in the context of a B2B offering, and we had conversations with potential customers, and we signed 2 letters of intents with 2 different customers as to, okay, if we are able to deliver on the different jobs to be done that we've described together, you're interested and you would work with us. Right? Obviously, they had preferential rates and preferential treatment. Important though, they were willing to pay. So they were willing to pay even for a beta, just early access to the value proposition. They just had a discount on the access. And then when we looked at the way to deliver, it was impossible for us to build a team that is able to build and onboard depots, build the algorithm that allows us to optimize the charging in of the cars and the depots, build an entire network of charge points across the country to allow people to charge their cars, and build the user experience that allowed us to tie it all together and provide a seamless access to the value. So we looked at, okay, how can we actually deliver this? And we knew that we had a risk. We were testing for value first. At the same time, we knew that to deliver that value, we needed absolutely to have a collaboration with a company to allow drivers to charge on their cars. And so what we ended up doing was we signed a memorandum of understanding with a well-known network in the country to say, okay, if we launch this venture, then you agree that our drivers will be able to, you will issue charge cards, and the drivers that are linked to our value proposition will be able to charge their cars at a certain rate that we will cover for them. Right? So we started to test here, what is the value that we're having? We have 2 letters of intent, and what is how are we going to deliver this with the memorandum of understanding with the network? And then we looked at, okay, well, the next bit is, okay, if we know we can build this and that there's value for this, how are we actually going to build it? And how are we going to monetize this? So we looked at viability, right? And again, product management will, traditional books will talk about a different series of experiments that you can run for a feature, a product, and so on and so forth. Some, again, that I like, piecemeal, which is just trying to pull things that exist already and bundle them into a value offering to see if that at least works financially. And then the usual stuff, like building a financial model to understand and the projections behind this. And so how did we do this? We actually ran a piecemeal. So I already touched on using a network of charge points outside of the depots. We also signed a memorandum of understanding and in the end, a collaboration with a partnership with a company that was doing depots installations and verifications. Because this was not part of our core value offering. We were there to help them manage the depots and the fleet itself, not especially install them. But we needed someone to help us get over that barrier of installation. And so we ran a piecemeal kind of user experience. And at the beginning, what it really looked like was we had a partner to install the depots in our first customer. We had a company, a partner that we ended up acquiring, but at that time was a partner in the US that had an algorithm that would allow us to manage the depot and charge the cars. We had as I mentioned, a partner for the charge outside, and most of the logging and user experience was actually emails. So we emailed with the customer every day or every few days. Whenever he had a question, the fleet manager would email us, and we would basically work with the different partners to answer that question or try to deliver it and send it back to them. We also ran willingness to pay surveys overall, so across all of the TAM that we had identified, to see, okay, outside of just an early adopter, what would be the willingness to pay there? And so that gave us a fine-grained understanding of what are people willing to pay, right? And again, granted, it's a Van Westendorp, so it's a would-do behavior, but we had already some paying customer, even if they were discounted. And then we had run the work, the different jobs to be done manually, so that we had a baseline for the cost. We knew that it would cost us so much when cars were being charged on the network. We knew it would cost typically so much to the customer to deploy their depots and get them certified. And we knew it would cost so much for the algorithm to run on the depots, right? So we were de-risking the business case, really, of that venture by going into the details and trying to do it manually first to see if we could continue. At any point in time, we could have stopped, right? So we hadn't really built any lines of code yet. We hadn't built any IP outside of just trying with a team of 4 people, trying to just combine all of these things together and make them work. But that gave us a better confidence in the viability, which gained us the ability to go back to our clients at the next investment gate and to say, actually, we believe this business case that has been reviewed is viable and it can make money. And this is why we believe, because we've done all of these things manually. The other thing was feasibility. So can we do this? Right? So I've spoken about the Wizard of Oz here already, but there's other techniques that you can use. Spikes and proof of concepts are 2 frequent techniques. Had different skills. They really represent the same thing, which is trying to write code to solve the problem, even if you know that the code might actually be thrown away, right? So probably everyone is familiar with these things. There's actually other techniques from a legal point of view. One thing that we did was we did a red team. So we hired a lawyer to try and break our contracts and try to attack us and see how they would create a legal case against us. Red teaming is a concept from cybersecurity that we just applied into a legal context. Right? Also, so in our example, we ran this red team, but we also ran a spike for the algorithm. So I told you we had this partner that had already an algorithm that was doing energy management. We thought, can we do this ourselves? Right? Because the partner was expensive as a partner, and the valuation of the company was relatively high, which meant if we wanted to buy it, it would actually be quite a costly thing to do. So we thought, okay, let's put a couple of engineers together, actually a bit more than a couple, and let's see if we can do the algorithm ourselves. We spiked it, and we very quickly learned that it would take us probably a year and a half to get back to a value proposition that that company had. And the cost-benefit analysis just showed that it was better to buy the company. It was just easier to buy the company. And so that's the thing we did in the end. We looked at, okay, how can we accelerate our time to market? How can we build the intellectual property in the company? And the better option versus building it yourself versus acquiring the company was acquiring the company. That was informed by a spike, us trying to do it by ourselves and realizing actually this is a lot more complicated than it is, or that it looks like. And then finally, learning quickly, right? Because through all of this, I think the theme that you can see is that the thing we were optimizing for was learning. Right? Learning how we can serve our customers. Learning what are the actual problems that a fleet manager has with their drivers. Again, through the emails and the conversations that we had, we were able to suss out really what's important, what isn't. And one thing that we were doing quite quickly is that we defined what is the North Star for this business. Right? And based on that, what are the different investment gates we had? Typically, the first one was 8 weeks, the second one was 3 months, and so on and so forth, that we wanted to follow. And based on that North Star and the learning outcomes that we had within those timeframes, we were able to unlock additional funding from the client to continue to build the venture. Right? So I mentioned already the one where we wanted to de-risk the business case because it was a relatively big investment. And so the client wanted to make sure that that business would be profitable. And so instead of just doing a business case and hoping that it was for the best, we ran the service manually to de-risk the viability of the business. Similarly, when the reason we did most of the tests through Wizard of Oz is because we wanted to have a direct hand into the conversation so that we would learn and suss out the real needs of the customers. So in the end, we combined a few models. As I said, we built in the overall customer experience to provide a branded, seamless experience for our customers and the drivers. We partnered with an on-the-go network for charging, and we purchased a company. And also, I didn't put it here, but with an installer and a certifier of depots and charge points. And then we purchased a company to do the site optimization because it turned out to make sense from a cultural and a value point of view. So the results were actually interesting for our clients. In 6 months, we were from the idea to the first customer was using it entirely with the value proposition as I described here. 2 years down the road, that piece of the business was valued at 2 billion, with different value propositions that ended up being built in addition to the one I spoke about. And we managed to go into 4 different countries within 12 months, thanks to the strategy that we put in place. Two of the core important elements there were we partnered with an on-the-go network and we partnered with installers so that each country has their own, which allowed us to develop different partnerships for the different countries. So that's how a bit of a product management lens allowed us to build a venture by thinking about what are the different risks that are really there for that venture, and then how can we de-risk those and run experiments so that we learn from these and we can tweak and pivot and snake our way into success by going through these experiences. One thing that I wanted to talk about very briefly before we go into the Fireside, and we can definitely open that conversation up later, is AI is there nowadays, and everyone talks about AI and how easy it is to create new businesses, to create new ventures, and for solopreneurs even to create their own companies. Not saying that's entirely incorrect. There are really amazing stats that come up from AI, like the time to market is typically divided by 2 for an FMCG company. That's again a McKinsey study. Some improvements have been measured up to 40%. There's a 25% delivery, faster delivery of a fintech product. And for a branch virtual assistants, again, you have all the sources here. But the thing I would caution against, and I have a small screenshot to talk about that in a sec, is yes, you go faster, but you need to make sure that you understand why you're trying to go towards what are you trying to solve, right? So it's great to go fast, but if you're going fast towards a wall, that's not amazing. Jeremy Clarkson was saying it's not speed that kills you, it's the fact that you become instantaneously stationary. So there's an article on Your Brain on ChatGPT, the acceleration of cognitive depth that came out a couple of weeks ago that I think is very interesting. I recommend reading there. Point being, great to go fast, but don't forget that you need to know where you're going first. Productivity improvements, yes, but quality tends to be lower. Dora reports from Google last year show that there's a 10% decrease in code's quality, which is the main thing that is being improved by AI today. And so again, really make sure that you know what you're doing and you know which prices you're paying at which points. And then quick, it doesn't mean legal nor ethical. And I have my little screenshot here. This is Timothée saw this, I think, yesterday or the day before. There's a new business that came up, and I'm not going to name them to not shame, but it's clearly a business that was created with Lovable, which is one of those tools that allows you to quickly create an application online that delivers some value. Honestly, website was great, value was very clear, value proposition was amazing, pricing made sense. But Timothée had the reflex of clicking on the legal conditions, and that's what they looked like. Right? So that business actually is not legal, and if we were to use it, we would probably be in troubled waters. But also, and you can read the fine print, there's some ethical gray zone here for that business. So while AI allowed that person to go really quick in building that product, it didn't make it legal, it didn't make it ethical, and so that's something that I would really pay attention to. Right? Now, that's what I had for us today. So what I wanted to talk about is how product management has helped me de-risk some of that venture building. And what I'm going to do now is open the floor to Laurent. Laurent, maybe you can say a few words about yourself, and then we can go into the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Very interesting keynote. I even learned something. So I'm Laurent Kinet. I've been building startups most of my professional life on technology, data, AI, but always intended to the B2B sector. So I've worked one foot in the startup open spaces and another one in the corporate boardrooms. And so over time, I've developed an acute translation engine between those two worlds because, having corporates collaborate with startups is like having gorillas dance with mice, as I like to say. So it's a challenge. And so this expertise in corporate startup collaboration has been, let's say, described in my book, Corporate Venturing, a Framework. And we distribute the value through keynotes, private talks, workshops, but also technology with the open innovation and innovation scouting technology platform Novable, which helps innovation professionals identify and validates the most relevant startups worldwide to feed their industrial processes and innovation projects, basically.
Yep. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts because, okay, my experience is venture building, right? That's mostly the model out of a bit of acquisition, a bit of strategy partnerships, but venture building has really been the one that started most of my experiences. Yeah. And to me, it's an interesting one because it combines this agility of startup, right? And this ability to just try things, break things, move fast, right? And learn, most importantly. But it's really two different worlds, right? So how do you reconcile that for yourself?
Yeah, it's true that venture building is one out of many ways of engaging with startups for corporations. Mm-hmm. And two things here. First, on the one side, large companies, corporations have now understood that collaborating with startups has become a mandatory exercise. They can't do everything alone. And we meet with hundreds of corporations, and we see a lot of initiatives going in that direction. And so it's a good trend. But some of them, not to say most of them, still remain at the surface of things. You know, they build showrooms instead of systems. So, they work with startups, but startups don't enter the core. They don't connect to the bloodstream. But on the other side, when venture building is concerned, it's true that a product mindset, so the discovery aspect and everything, is more than useful. It's required, and not only for venture building, for any other model. It requires what I call a structural porosity, an organizational permeability to enable ventures go past MVP. And this porosity concept is something I like a lot, because it has a lot of impact on corporate innovation. So the porosity mindset, it's a design philosophy, let's say, because most collaborations, most corporate venturing activities are still built around the outside-in mindset. So you have the startup outside; it's the outsider, and you spot it, you scout it, you run a POC, or maybe you acquire it. So you bring it into the system, and you try to control the flow. But experience tells that real innovation actually doesn't want to be absorbed. It wants to be exchanged, through a membrane. So the porosity is a kind of intentional permeability. So it's allowing ideas, capital, talent, culture flowing both ways. So from the corporate to the startup and the other way around. And so when you have this porosity mindset, you shift from absorb to embed, let's say, to you go from manage innovation to host transformation. So this is the porosity. And we have 3 layers of porosity. And that's interesting to understand the importance of it when you build ventures from inside. The first is the human porosity. So it's the front door. It's where people start mingling together, cross boundaries. And what I like to say is that this is the easiest to underestimate and to forget. But it's also the most powerful to unlock, because no matter how smart your processes are, if the people don't trust each other, it dies. So it's the first requirement of everything. So it's for example, leaving your teams develop real relationships with startups, not just manage transactions, for example. So when a manager feels challenged or a founder feels recognized, it's when collaboration becomes powerful. The second layer is the process layer. So it's what we call the machinery layer. It's when things start to become complex, and usually it's when most startup collaboration process are likely to die, because it involves building exceptions to corporates' existing processes. And so it's very it's the middle layer, let's say. It's friction focused. So it involves, as I said, putting your internal processes at work and change your habit to make it work. And you have a lot of examples for that. For example, the famous venture clienting, which is a very used model currently, is typically in this process porosity layer. And finally, you have the deepest one, which is the strategic layer. And this is where you start asking, how do we build through startups instead of how do we work with them? So it's also the most uncomfortable, because it forces you to admit we may not have the best answer inside. So it's having startups helping you shape your roadmap instead of just feeding it. And so this is very interesting, because when you think in those terms, in porosity, it means that your company is more a membrane than a moat that is made of apertures, and what's important is that the 3 layers must stay open. I think that the next slide shows that, because if even one layer is closed, then the flow stops. And so this can be applied to venture building because it's not a laboratory but an exchange. So it's not about absorbing the outside. It's about dissolving the boundaries, more or less.
Yeah, definitely realize that one of the
One at your door.
yeah, the door is opening. Sorry about that. There we go. What I was going to say is one of the keystone criteria for success for our venture was actually to bring some of that human aspect into our incumbent clients by building some of that culture, bringing some of those people that have done innovation and that could just build on top of that and kind of diffuse it into the organization, the people, and then the processes of how to do this. But so we've been a bit mysterious, right? We've talked about venture building and as being one of the 50 models that you speak about. Maybe you can help us understand a bit more. What are some of the other ones that are viable, and how do you think about one versus the other?
Yeah, very good question. Venture building is indeed one of many other ways to engage with startups, and sometimes we consider that engaging with startup building is the only way to do it, and that's totally understandable. But just like products, ventures can be trapped inside corporate walls, as I explained. So maybe venture building might not be the most appropriate tool to reach the expected objective. So it's a mean to an end. So if you ask any or lots of innovation professionals, okay, can you list me the startup engagement models that exist out there? You will certainly have the big five: M&A, CVC, venture clienting, startup program, accelerators. But those big five are a toolbox that was designed in 2010 for a world that doesn't exist anymore. There are way other models existing. So it's time to open this broader toolbox. And I list 50 of them in the book. Of course, there are way more than that, but it's a starting point. And I organized them based on the level of commitment that they require. So if you start on the left side, it's just scratching the surface. You can scout for startup. You can landscape your environment. It's already an engagement because you talk about that and you get inspired by the flow. And to the very end, the very right side of the spectrum, you have the transactional ways of engaging with startups, M&A, venture building, joint ventures, strategic partnerships, basically. And in between, you have a lot of other ways to do that. You have some who are pretty well known, like venture clienting, but also innovation lab, corporate open data challenge. So what's important is to identify which of those models are the most suitable for my objectives. And what we have seen so often is companies engaging in launching an accelerator to stay simple, without connecting that to the very objectives that they want to achieve. And the framework that is described and developed in the book is precisely that. How do we reconnect the means with the goals, basically? So we don't have the time to browse all of the engagement models right now, but we could give a couple of more examples later.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, if there's anyone who has a question looking at the time, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure to try and answer them as we go through. But as you think about your questions, maybe Laurent, how do you choose? Right? You mentioned like anchoring it to your strategy, which makes sense. And maybe the one thing I see and I reflected on when you were explaining this was I could use a lot of those as experiments as well. I could use one to try and see, okay, is this direction making sense? And then pivot to building a venture a bit later to maybe make it more concrete, or the other way around. So how do you think? How do you to make those decisions?
Yeah, you should start thinking the other way around. So instead of asking yourself which model is the best for me, for my culture, my sector, whatever, you should ask yourself, what objectives do I want to achieve through corporate venturing or through collaborating with startups?
Mm-hmm.
And you can also ask this question for venture building itself. Because I've met hundreds of corporate innovators who did not know how to even formulate the strategic objectives. So I decided to help them with a first list of 100 benefits. And when I say on the book cover is 100 ways startups can transform your organization. And of course, you have more than 100, just like for the models, but it's a starting point. And these are listed from experience from the Novable collaboration with clients, but also from my whole career. And those benefits, we could also call them strategic objectives. I organized them in categories, 8 categories, 4 in the core business area and 4 in the support functions, because we sometimes tend to forget that even the support functions are in dire need of innovation, and especially those ones more and more. And then the idea is to, okay, how do I identify the benefits I want to get or the objectives I want to reach, to meet? In the book, we explain and we propose some iterative methodology to do that. But the idea, once we have identified that, is to cross-reference the most suitable models that will help you achieve those specific objectives. And this is basically the matrix that is, I think, is the next slide, where our experience just cross-reference models with objectives. So the means with the goals. So for instance, if one of your strategic objectives through collaborating with startups is to internalize new R&D capabilities, just to take an example, then the model will tell you which of the 50 models that are listed are the most likely to help you achieve that objective based on case studies, references, and experiences that we have made. And of course, it's a starting point. You can break that, and you can also disagree with that. And it's the best way to do that is to add a dot or remove one because your own experience tells something different. But at least it helps you take the first step, which is often the most difficult to take. And it will, in a couple of hours, literally, to help you going from a vague ambition to a structured open innovation strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is often used by innovation teams within large companies to have something to break, to have something to discuss about, and to bring people around the table and say, hey, no, I don't agree. I see this like this. Because before that, the corporate venturing literature was either too theoretical or less iterative. So what I wanted to do is transform theory into a very practical way, hands-on way of doing things, a bit inspired from the business model generation canvas. If you want.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I would have loved to have that because there's a lot of those models that I didn't know existed before. But and I think we have questions. But one thing that I wanted to ask before we go there is, okay, we talk about startups, right? And that's a bit of like a wide term, as in like startups in general. Cool.
Yeah.
I know for myself, I ended up finding this company, which was a bit more than a startup for the energy management, by honestly browsing a lot of Google and giving calls to experts and being like, hey, who the hell is doing this thing? Because I need to do it. Can you find me someone who does that? And I was lucky to have the network of McKinsey to get through that relatively quickly, right? So I was lucky. But you talk about all of this. How do you solve this nowadays?
Yeah. It's the very reason why we decided with Olivier to create Novable. Not only because scouting startup just fulfills one tiny step in the innovation value chain, but because we consider scouting being the foundations of everything else. And to answer what you thought about startups, we say startup because it's easy to understand, but we should say innovative entities, because it can also be scale-ups, SMEs, non-profit, or academic research centers, whatever. So anywhere where innovation lies or hides. And we developed this technology, completed with expertise, to quickly identify the most relevant outside innovation that could help you push your innovation projects further, or just to inspire you with what's cooking up out there, or depending on the use case, you can, in any case, start by scouting. So scouting and building, when we were talking about venture building, scouting and building are the two sides of the same corporation innovation coin. So you should scout before you build, basically, because it will avoid you redundancies, it will import best practices, it will benchmark your ideas, find new angles and edges, and even secure viability, just by knowing your environment and by not reinventing the wheel. So, you can scout for any kind of use case for corporate innovation, but we structure that in three main categories. First, you can observe the market, so what's cooking about there, as I said, or you can collaborate. Venture clienting is being the most prominent model, or you can transact, so invest or partner. So for anything, so scouting for any companies in this world should be a process, not a project, because it should be a permanent layer of antennas open. So it's the foundation of everything. It's the best tool to ensure the porosity mindset, basically.
Yeah.
And with Novable, we do that using AI and expertise, which helps.
It does, absolutely. I'm going to take the questions that we have from the group. I'll just take the first one to begin with. I don't know if you can all see that, but apparently I put it in the middle of the screen. What internal processes most often get in the way of rapid testing or launching?
That is for you.
That is for me. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think... So I'm going to take a bit of a step back from this question, because the question is biasing my answer. So there are a few things that make it hard in companies to rapidly test and launch, right? But I would argue they're usually not process per se. I would actually argue, in my experience, that it's culture, right? So I'll take this oil and gas client as an example. And to give you an idea about their culture, they had this rule where anywhere in any of their offices, you could not walk downstairs with your phone in your hands, and you could not walk downstairs without holding the ramp, right? Now, there's a reason for this, because they actually have oil rigs out in the ocean, and in an oil rig, it's a really dangerous behavior to have, right? And it can lead to death and illnesses or hurt people, right? So it's a perfectly viable and valuable piece of culture to have, right? But what it does mean is that it's not a risk-taking culture, right? They're not familiar with the fact of even taking a risk by walking downstairs with your phone, which, if I'm being honest, that it's not too much of a risk, right? And so the things that get the most in front of rapid testing or taking risks or trying things is typically this culture of the incumbents company. Now, that's usually why my advice to go away from this with clients is twofold. Is one, as much as possible, try to create an entirely different entity, a different company, right? You have 100% ownership of that company. That's entirely fine. The revenues are yours, but it's a different company. And you can use some of the internal services like HR and payroll and stuff so that you manage the cost of that external company. But it is an external one with different people, right? Because then you have the opportunity, at least, to just restart a new culture, right? And not take some of that culture with you, which unfortunately can be a bit of a slowdown. The other thing is very practical, and it follows. It's get different offices. Don't work in the same space. You can have co-working spaces and where some of the incumbents share the desk with the venture building or the innovation part, right? That's great, and that's a great way to maintain porosity to some degree. But don't go in the headquarters of the main office in the fancy, cushy, beautiful offices to build a venture, right? Because it's not the same mindset. You want something scrappy, you want something fast. And again, it goes back to culture and the environment in which you build the thing, right? In terms of processes, I actually would argue that corporate processes to some degree are valuable for startups. So one of the things that really helped me in building ventures was I had a board meeting every month. I had to prepare for my board meeting every month. But it did mean that I had to really think about what are the decisions that we're making? Why are we making those decisions? And how am I going to justify to my quote unquote investors that I'm making those decisions? And if you have great people on the other side that are willing to try with you, then you have this great balance and equilibrium where they force you to articulate, think, and express your thinking in a way that it can be challenged and it can add value. Right? So I hope I'm answering some of the question by this, but for me, it's mostly culture and human versus process per se. Anything you want to add, Laurent?
No, it's perfectly aligned with the porosity concept we evoked earlier.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, for a corporation to be transparent, it means that you should ensure mobility and even geographic mobility. So the physical place where you build ventures might be important if you still have access to the core. But apart from that, I totally agree with what you said.
Yeah. Let me take one for you. The last one that we had. So Caspar is asking, it was somewhat covered, but could you give a couple of examples of unexpected startup engagement models we don't usually see, or the underestimated ones?
Yeah, that's a very good question because even if I listed 50 engagement models, you have some stars, and also it's a very it's a practice that evolves very fast. So you have stars and peaks and lows. For instance, corporate accelerators are decreasing in terms of traction. But I will take a couple of examples that foster human porosity because, as I said, it's the easier to underestimate. And we have in the list um, people-focused models like secondment programs, talent exchange programs, skill development workshops. You know, there are models where you have more than interactions, you have exchanges. So, you know, when an executive spends some time, a couple of months in a startup and comes back changed in his work with a mind shift in his work, or when a founder spends some time or walks your factory floor and gives a fresh perspective on things and see things that your team missed. So those engagement models are very interesting because they require low commitment, low budget, while having a big impact, and especially in terms of human interaction. So to encourage to foster this first human layer of porosity to be efficient, you have in the toolbox some things that does not require business cases to define at board meetings, but that you can decide even yourself without even swiping your credit cards. So I would take those examples because we have seen such models in companies, but not a lot, and it's totally underestimated in terms of impact. You also have some examples like advisory or board seat roles, where a corporate executive or even a middle manager takes a board seat at a startup, bringing the experience from a large company and maybe for the market the startup is targeting, but also getting back home with a lot of startup reflexes and things like that. So I would strongly recommend companies engage with those models that are really the barriers to that are very low.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I see we're at the top of the hour, so we can continue to engage on LinkedIn if you have some questions. Happy to try to answer some on the event post as well. Thank you, Laurent, for being with me for
Thank
this
you, Martin.
conversation, bringing your wealth of experience.
Thank you for hosting this.
Of course. And I wish you all a very good day, sunny day in Belgium, for if you are around here. And see you next time. Thank you.
Have a nice day ahead. Bye.